Our project is now at a stage where it will generate a different random image each time we reload the browser. Of course, this is not the way we want our app to perform. We want to call a random image after a certain time delay. So the way we're going to do this is by grabbing our code which generates the random image. We're going to place this inside of a function and then call this function after a certain time delay. So let's create a new function just above this. And we're going to create this function using a slightly different syntax than the previous project. We're going to create what is called a Es6 Arrow Function. And an arrow function is basically a different syntax than the regular functions that we've used previously. There is also some technical differences too between the two function syntaxes, although we won't be covering these inside this course. And this function is going to contain all of this syntax just here. So the way we write an Es6 arrow function, we're going to store a function name called generate inside of a constant. And then we're going to set this equal to our function. We set the arrow function just like this, and then the curly braces. So inside of these brackets just here, just like when we looked at the regular functions in the previous project, we can also pass arguments inside of here too. So for example, if we had a value, we could pass it just like this and then access our value inside the function. But all we want to do is to grab these lines of code and then paste these in. We now have this function which we can now call, and we want to call this function after a certain time delay. Let's do this just below. We can create a second function, which I'm going to call a timer. And the way we can run some code inside of JavaScript is by taking advantage of setInterval. SetInterval is a function which takes in two arguments. The first one is the code which we want to run. So we already have the code available inside this generate function. So we can pass in generate as the first argument. And then the second one is a time delay. So this time delay is in milliseconds. So 1 second would be equal to 1000. 2 seconds would be 2000, and so on. And the way we can call this function is by using the play button. If we go back to our index page, we have the play button inside of this commented out section. So let's reinstate this. And then we can call this from our play button. We'll do this on a click. So let's set the on click equal to our timer. Over to the browser, let's reload this and click on the play button. Okay, so after our 2 second delay, we see a new image has been randomly generated and placed at the end of our div. So just to recap, when we click on play, we call our timer function. This timer function will run every 2 seconds and then call our generate function, which generates a new random image. So as we've just seen, this is not ideal because we want to replace the existing image rather than add this to the end of our image container. One of the ways we can fix this is to add a if statement and check if an image already exists before we go ahead and add a new one. So just before we add this image, we can create an if statement. This is going to check if our image container, remember this image container was the wrapper just here, which is going to contain all of our images inside. So if our image container, and then we can say dot has child nodes. And this is a method which is going to check if our image container contains any child elements. Currently it doesn't because it's empty, there's nothing in between our div. But if there is an image there in place, we're going to run some code which will remove this. So first of all, we'll select our image container, and then we can call a method called removeChild. And the way we can select which child element we want to remove is by using a method called firstElementChild. We call this on our container, so our image container, and then select firstElementChild. So we're saying here that if our image container has anything nested inside, we're then going to remove this, and the item we want to remove is the very first element inside. The first element is always going to be our image, since there's nothing else inside of our div. Let's save this and give this a try. Click on play. And now we only see one image at a time. The next issue which we need to deal with, if you will notice when we click on play, there is a time delay before our first image will appear. This time delay is the 2 seconds, which was set just here. And this will cause us a small problem because we want to start the game as soon as the user has clicked on play. So the way we can fix this is by calling our generate function as soon as the game starts. And then as soon as this is running, we can then rely on our timer to continue with the rest of the images. Okay, so let's create a new constant just below, which is going to handle this. This is going to be a function called play. And once again, we'll set up our arrow function. We're then going to call this play function as soon as the game starts. So rather than our timer, we'll change this to play. And as soon as the game starts, we're going to call our generate function. This will be called once. We'll then call our timer function. Let's try this out. And as soon as we click on play inside the browser, we should see our first image, which we do. And then after our time delay, the rest of the images begin to generate. The next thing to take care of is to actually end our game. If we reduce our timer down to a really small number, so let's say 300 milliseconds, and then click on play. This will then cycle through all of our 20 images, but it will keep going and not know when to stop. So we see here that we've gone over 20 images, but the game still continues to run. One of the ways we can fix this is by reducing the number of images or removing an image after one has been generated. So currently we're generating a random number, meaning our random number can generate 20 different images. Once this function has run, if we would then remove an image from our array, this will then leave us with 19 options and 18 and 17 and so on. So the way we can remove an image is by selecting our images array. We can use a JavaScript Splice method, which is going to remove a value from our array. Splice is going to take in two separate values, and the first one which we'll pass in is going to be the image which we want to remove. So if we want to remove the first image, this would be position 0, position 1, and so on. We already know which image we're currently dealing with because we have this stored inside of the random number. So let's pass this in. And then the second value is the number of items we want to remove. We're only going to remove one value, so let's leave this as 1. So just to recap, we are randomly selecting any of our images from the array. We are then pushing this to the DOM and displaying this inside of our project. And then finally, we'll remove this image from our array so it can't be selected more than once. This now means if we go back to the browser and start our game, we should now only see 20 images appear in the browser. Let's try this. There we go, and the game now stops because we don't have any more images to cycle through. This now means our image array is now reduced to 0, and we now have a way to end the game. But one thing we need to do is to also stop our timer too. At the moment, the set interval timer has no way to know when it should stop. So therefore, we need to tell set interval to stop manually, so it doesn't continue to use the browser's resources. So we had set interval inside of here, and the way we can stop this is by calling clear interval. I'm also going to store this inside of a function called stop timer. All this function is going to do is to call our clear interval function. We then need to pass in a reference to our timer inside a clear interval. We can do this by passing set interval to a variable. So let's call this variable timerref. And then we can set timerref to be equal to our set interval. Now we have this reference. We can now pass this to clear interval, so it knows which timer we need to clear. The reason we have declared this variable outside of a function rather than inside is because we can then access this in any other functions. If we declared our variable inside of this function, we could only access it inside of this timer. which would then cause an error when we try to reference it in our clear interval. So let's move this back outside. And now we need to call our stop timer function at the end of our game. Our game has ended once we have no more images left in the array, because we are removing them on each generation. So inside of our generate function, we can check if our images.length is equal to 0. We can then call our stop timer function, and also use the return keyword, meaning this will then break out of our function and the code below will no longer run. So let's save this and test this out in the browser. We can click play, and this should now cycle through 20 of our images and then stop the timer. Good, so with this now in place, we'll move on to the next video where we'll take care of generating a number to display to the user.